listening to the Labor Notes podcast, the weekly show from Labor Notes on rank-and-file news and organizing tactics. I'm pod co-host Danielle Smith, an organizer at Labor Notes.
And I'm pod co-host Natasha Elena Yulman, and a staff writer at Labor Notes. If you're a regular listener of the pod, you'll remember our episode a few weeks back about SINTTIA, Mexico's independent national auto workers union. When we last talked about them, their members in Silao, who are GM auto workers there, recently ran a pretty serious contract campaign and won double-digit raises.
And if you're not a regular listener of the pod, you know what they say.
The best time to become a regular pod listener was back in March when we launched, but the second best time
is now. And you can always go back and listen to our archive. So this union is the one we talked about back in April, where they were doing so well, it was like this wake-up call for company unions in Mexico.
Right, so SINTTIA is very serious about an industrial vision, not just having a couple plants with great contracts, but organizing the industry as a whole. So that has meant two things. First, there is a real and exciting potential here for what Mexican auto workers can fight for and win. And second, auto executives have a very powerful incentive to stop them.
Okay, I want to hear everything. Let's make this a whole SINTTIA update episode.
Let's do it.
Why don't we start with a quick refresher? What is SINTTIA and what have its members won so far?
Sure, so SINTTIA, as we were saying, is the National Auto Workers Union, and it's an independent union in Mexico. It grew out of the really courageous organizing efforts of GM auto workers in Silao, Guanajuato, who, back in 2022, voted out their previous union, an affiliate of the Confederation of Mexican Workers known as CTM. The CTM is notorious for, as I reported back in April, locking in these basically protection contracts for members with abysmal pay and working conditions, basically the floor of what these companies are already legally obligated to provide. All that does is benefit the boss by keeping wages down and preventing workers from forming a real union. So, after voting down their corrupt, basically company union, workers voted in SINTTIA not long after by a landslide. They got 78% of the vote. Since then, SINTTIA has been on a winning streak, most recently in April of this year, when those GM workers in Silao won record raises despite all the uncertainty given Trump's tariff threats.
Yeah, and all those new listeners who just decided that they want to commit to listening to this pod can go back and check out that episode that we released on April 25th. It's called Mexican Auto Workers Faced Down Tariff Threats and Won Double-Digit Raises. And we're talking about SINTTIA again now because, as you reported more recently, they're starting to gain some ground after that win.
Yeah, so workers at a second General Motors assembly plant in Mexico have now been organizing to join SINTTIA at GM's San Luis Potosí plant, which employs about 6,500 workers. They also voted out their previous union, a CTM affiliate, back in 2023. If SINTTIA manages to win at the San Luis Potosí plant and negotiate a shared contract, it would be a huge deal. Willebaldo Gómez Zuppa, a SINTTIA advisor, told me that in the 100 years of Mexico's auto industry, no two facilities have had a shared contract. Not even when plants were organized by the same union and were a mere 15 miles apart, as was the case at Ford. Clearly, it's a precedent that employers want to avoid at all costs.
It sounds like SINTTIA is really recognizing an opportunity here to do something that would meaningfully change the dynamic between workers, unions, and the bosses.
Yeah, it really speaks to SINTTIA's industrial vision, that they're not just content to win at a few plants here and there and win good salaries and working conditions and call it a day. They understand that organizing everywhere is what will make their own gains more safe.
That sounds really hopeful and inspiring and kind of like an auto boss's worst nightmare. What's it been like on the ground?
The GM workers at San Luis Potosí have been without a union the last couple years since they voted out the corrupt CTM affiliate that represented them. So GM then creates basically a labor management committee at the facility, something it calls a labor council, which Gómez Zuppa told me was basically just so they could say, see, we take the workers into account. GM, of course, handpicked people on the committee, and surprise, surprise, it's basically all CTM loyalists.
That sounds pretty bad, but not surprising from what we've heard. Also, for folks listening, especially those who might be a fan of our Stewards Corners, we're going to have an episode on labor management committees coming out. So be sure to check that out. It's going to cover why they're pretty much always bad news and how to still make it work if you're stuck with one. But coming back to the committee in your story, what are they up to now?
So it's pretty sketchy. So SINTTIA filed to represent the workers in the San Luis Potosí facility on April 21st. Within hours, a second union called Carlos Leone began collecting signatures. And what's really telling is that the day SINTTIA's effort to represent workers at this plant went public, the majority of representatives on the Labor Council resigned and began collecting signatures for the Carlos Leone union. SINTTIA's supporters are accusing GM management of supporting this other union in an effort to ward off a legitimate union at the facility. But first, let me back up and explain these competing signatures. The way things work in Mexico is, to represent workers at a worksite, you have to be able to show you have 30% of worker support. If another union then jumps in and says, we want to represent workers, they have to show that they too have 30% support, and if they too meet that threshold, there's an election. So there was a strange situation back when SINTTIA sought to represent workers at the first plant in Silao. 3 other unions emerged from the woodwork, stating that they also had reached the 30% bar to represent workers, among them another CTM-affiliated union. Are you sensing a pattern here? And one that claimed to be independent, but was quietly operating out of CTM offices. But you know what? The math absolutely did not check out, because even though there were 3 other unions on the ballot, and each of them supposedly had collected signatures of support from 30% of the plant's workers, SINTTIA swept the election with 78% of the vote. So then, how could these unions have even met the 30% bar? It's actually still unclear how the other unions even got on the ballot.
Whoa, that's sketchy. So what is the Carlos Leone Union? Is it a known entity?
So this union has been called a union for hire for employers to stave off authentic union campaigns, and some even allege it has ties to organized crime. And there are some indications that GM appears to be favoring this Carlos Leone union. For one thing, workers are able to collect signatures for Carlos Leone on company time, unlike SINTTIA, the union said. SINTTIA also alleges that Carlos Leone somehow has these comprehensive lists of sensitive worker information that's needed to file for union representation, like their full names, date of hire, and CURP numbers, which is basically like a Mexican social security number. That's kind of information that, logically only could have come from management, right? Another thing is that GM has also been matching everything that SINTTIA has won over the past few years, giving just about the same to workers at its other plants, to the point that HR has allegedly been telling workers, why organize? You have everything they get, and you don't have to pay union dues.
That sounds like when non-union automakers in the U.S. suddenly decided to give out their own raises after the UAW Big 3 strike in 2023 won members record wage hikes.
Yeah, absolutely. These bosses have definitely got the same playbook. And then there's this other bizarre development in the saga. A few weeks back, this video popped up that's been widely shared among Mexican GM workers on social media. In the video, you see a person collecting signatures for the Carlos Leone Union being shoved and yelled at by a supposed SINTTIA organizer who's just sort of making a scene and putting the union in a bad light. But there is one tiny problem with this narrative, and that's that this is not a SINTTIA member or, as far as SINTTIA can tell, even an employee at the facility at all.
How did management react to the news of this altercation?
It was actually SINTTIA that brought this video to GM's legal team. And that in and of itself is interesting, right? That it's SINTTIA approaching GM and not the other way around. If a member of your union is openly assaulting a fellow employee, I'm pretty sure you're going to hear about it from management, right? But anyway, SINTTIA reached out to GM's legal team and presented a few facts. First, the SINTTIA organizer, who is portrayed as the aggressor, her language and accent suggest that she's not from San Luis Potosí. Second, they point out that she's got a completely new GM shirt on, and GM hasn't given out new uniforms any time recently. They give them out maybe 3 times per year. It's impossible for someone to have a completely new shirt because people wear them for work. Third, she was wearing sneakers where, if you see in the video, all of the workers are wearing the required safety shoes. And in addition, what are the odds that security is just nowhere to be found as this alleged worker is able to make a scene? Alejandra Morales, SINTTIA's general secretary, told GM, "If that was someone from my union, security and HR would have been there on the spot because they surveil us day and night."
That's a pretty good point. So, what does GM say to all this?
We got this emailed statement from a GM spokesperson. At GM, we respect the freedom of collective association and the exercise of trade union rights, and as always, we will act in accordance with the law and cooperate with the authorities throughout this process.
That statement sounds pretty familiar to many I've seen from companies before. In a way, what you've been describing seems to be a recognition of what you were saying earlier, that SINTTIA is doing new things that can change the status quo for Mexican auto workers.
I think that's right. Gómez Zuppa talked about how SINTTIA's vision has always been, it's no use having a little plant with great working conditions and pay. Because ultimately, he says, across the auto sector, all of the other plants are pushing conditions downward. He says that the union is fighting to establish a shared wage floor, and in so doing, pressure these do-nothing pro-boss unions to keep up and ultimately push them out altogether. Improving standards for the long haul will depend on independent unions like SINTTIA, building density in the sector as a whole, and starting with key players like GM. All of this together, SINTTIA's industrial vision, the fact that they're starting with one of the biggest movers in the industry that largely sets industry standards, it's a big deal.
These are some wild and consequential developments in independent organizing efforts. Thanks so much for bringing us up to speed. When will we know the outcome?
Workers will have a union election between June 25th through the 27th, and we'll have an update not long after that.
Thank you, Natasha. That's our show. We do have a couple of workshop announcements. This month's Stewards Workshop on the topic of maintaining unity in an open shop is on Wednesday, June 25th. And we've got our next contract campaign workshop series on Mondays, July 7th and July 14th. You can sign up at labornotes.org/events.
Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode. The Labor Notes Podcast is produced by Danielle Smith, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by Labor Notes organizer Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.